Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting of the Ordinance Committee of the Norwalk Common Council to order. My name is Tom Livingston, substituting in for the chair, Lisa Shanahan, who is unable to be here tonight. It is 7:01, and I'll start with taking the roll call. Is Mr. Keegan?
Here.
Mr. Hubelman?
Present.
Mr. Goldstein?
Here.
Ms. Johnson?
Here.
And me, Tom Livingston. So we have a quorum, and we'll look at the agenda. So we have nothing on the public hearing. Next item then will be public comment. Is there anyone who signed up to speak or wants to speak at this meeting?
I do not see any public attendees at this time.
Has anyone received any correspondence from anyone that should be inserted into the record? All right, seeing none, I will close the public comment period and move to acceptance of the minutes of October 19th, 2021. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Well, Mr. Keegan, thank you. Any comments, revisions, changes? Okay, all in favor, indicate by raising your hand, saying aye. Opposed? Abstentions? One abstention, Mr. Goldstein. Excuse me one second. Hold on.
Yeah, Brian, just abstaining because I wasn't actually on this committee at the last meeting.
That's correct. Thank you, Josh.
Apologize. Okay, so thank you. Let's move on to old business. Discuss and vote on Chapter 45, Article 4, Outdoor Dining Standards, Guidelines for Outdoor Dining. Brian, do you want to take this lead?
Sure.
Or do you want to talk to somebody? Ask Ms. Bonacek to do it.
Whatever works for everybody is fine with me.
Yes, do you want to walk us through it?
I would love to. Yep, absolutely. So good evening, everyone. We've actually talked about outdoor dining a couple of times, just as a reminder and some background. The governor passed an executive order at the beginning of COVID that allowed outdoor dining regulations to be lifted to a certain extent to allow small businesses and restaurants in particular an opportunity to utilize outdoors for their outdoor dining patrons. And that was a big piece of allowing restaurants to get to 100% capacity because, of course, the governor and state had restrictions on capacity indoors. So at that point in time, the executive order was extended multiple times. It then got put into a piece of legislation, and the legislation got passed by the House and the Senate. And the legislation basically adopted all of the regs and statutes that were included in the executive order. So the piece of legislation that's currently in place now expires on March the 31st. So we've been talking about outdoor dining for the last number of months. And I believe this committee had other business to attend to, such as trees and some of the other things. So it's been a couple of meetings since we talked about outdoor dining. But essentially what we're trying to do here is take our outdoor dining ordinance that was written many moons ago and has antiquated language in it, and update that ordinance to be able to include the pieces that we want moving forward, knowing that the piece of legislation expires on March the 31st. And so we're trying to make sure that we have in place an ordinance that restaurants and small businesses know what their goal lines are and what their goalposts are, and trying to be able to meet what we need and how we need it. There were a couple thoughts on the way in which we structured the outdoor dining ordinance for you today to have a look at the draft. One was that the original outdoor dining ordinance included a lot of the very nuanced, specific information regarding what barriers look like, how high they should be, what the process was or should be to go through for permitting. It also included very nuanced information regarding other ordinances, and so on and so forth. What we tried to do here was actually peel away some of the nuanced enforcement from the actual ordinance itself and create a standard and guideline document that partners or marries with the actual ordinance itself So what you see before you, as far as the ordinance goes, is an outdoor dining ordinance that's been updated.
Jess, excuse me 1 second. I just want to note that Ms. Nizinski Eichner has just joined us at 7:06. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So wanted to just let you know that the ordinance actually has a sister document or a partner document that is the guidelines and standards, where a lot of the nuanced data sits. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, we have the ability to be nimble and have the ability to update the guidelines and standards in a process that is more of a policy process at the staff level. Two, the ordinance then can be changed over time, but the guidance and standards allows us to be a little bit more responsive to what's going on out there. The second piece I think that's important is that those guidelines and standards basically have been looked at by, and the ordinance has been looked at by DPW, fire, police, health, planning and zoning, building and code enforcement, transportation, mobility and parking, and a few other agencies out there. So we've really done due diligence in being able to pass through what we've put together for you to look at today, knowing that all of the departments have weighed in on that. And we've taken comments on that as well. And then I would say the last piece, and Brian, just fill in any of the blanks here that I may have left out. But the other piece is that everything that was included in the executive order and everything that was included in the piece of legislation has to a large part been included in our ordinance. But not only that, we also, Brian did a really heavy lift where he spoke to Westport, he spoke to Greenwich, he spoke to many different communities and looked at many communities' ordinances for outdoor dining. And we built the outdoor dining ordinance and the guidelines and standards with using examples of what other communities are doing so that we're in line with those. The one thing that I will flag that is not in the outdoor dining ordinance or the guidelines and standards that was included in the executive order and the piece of legislation is that piece allowed no parking, no requirement for parking. So for example, if a restaurant wanted to use their parking lot for outdoor dining, they could use up to 100% of their parking spaces for outdoor dining. And that was allowed through the regulation itself. That piece has not been included in the ordinance and the guidelines and standards that you see. So it's important to note that any restaurant that's out there that has a private parking lot, they will need to meet parking zoning for parking as required by zoning and planning. So wanted to point that out. But Tom or Brian, if I've forgotten anything, please fill in the gaps.
No, I think you covered it very well. Just a couple of things, particularly from the newbies. We were given as just said, the proposed ordinance, and the goal, if we can get there tonight, would be to. It needs a little work. I don't think too much work, but a little work. If we can get comfortable with the tonight, we can send it to public hearing at the January meeting, and then we can ultimately get it approved before the March 31st deadline. We have a little time, but I just want to. That's sort of the goal. Again, it doesn't have to necessarily be done tonight, but that's the ultimate goal, is to get approved by March 31st. And as Jess said, it's kind of a balance with the ordinance. We want to put enough things there in terms of the operations as to help the enforcement of the ordinance, such things as, who's responsible for things and some of the basics like that. On the one hand, on the other hand, we wanted to leave the flexibility to, well, Jess, I guess your department is responsible for the permitting and all of the, as you call, the nuanced items. So we don't want to get too much into the weeds in order to give them the flexibility to adapt as necessary to get this to work for everybody. So that's
right. The other piece too, actually, that I think might be helpful is to give a little bit of background on, before we entered into COVID, the outdoor dining process was actually 3 separate processes. One where you needed to go through zoning, another you need to go through health, and another piece was that you needed to go through the law department to be able to sign an agreement to use the public right of way. So what we did when COVID began was we actually took the paper document the 3 separate paper processes, and we merged them all into one process and we put it online. So we were able to allow over 100 restaurants to go through the permitting process, which allowed streamlining. If we did the paper process, what we were doing was taking in the application process, and once each department had approved it, it went to the next department, then it went to the next department, so on and so forth. The way in which we did it this time during COVID is that we did an online application. We accepted all of the documentation online. It meant that it saved it into a database. So we had a record of all of the restaurants electronically. We also had a record of all of the documentation that they submitted electronically. It was submitted to planning and zoning. Planning and zoning distributed it to all of the different departments at one time. Each of the departments worked with the restaurateur if they had any issues or concerns. When the department had approved their portion, they emailed Brian Baker in planning and zoning. Brian Baker kept a note of that in the electronic database. And when all the departments had received approval or given approval, then Brian was able to issue the permit. So I say that because the way in which we've talked about the ordinance and the guidelines and standards actually supports that online approach, that continued online approach, which we think works really, really well as well. So just wanted to mention that from a process standpoint. There's language in the ordinance that speaks to the departments that are approving or permitting the actual outdoor dining itself. So you'll see a lot of references to the director of planning and zoning or his or her designee. So those are, and again, to Tom's point, that stays consistent. That's always been the process, and it really allows us to enforce the way in which we do outdoor dining. I think the interesting piece about this is that there's a lot of language in there that speaks to the ability to pull or revoke the permit, or the ability to be able to issue the permit if there's any violations in any way, shape, or form. And that includes violations that aren't just outdoor dining violations. It could be violations that are related to noise ordinance or any other violation that relates outside of the outdoor dining. So I just wanted to flag that as well. We want to make sure that we have really good actors who are utilizing outdoor dining. And this allows, the language in there allows us to have the flexibility to permit those folks that we think are doing a good job. And it allows us the flexibility to be able to say, you know, you've had a number of violations in the past. We don't think that you should be moving forward with this.
Any more questions about the context before we turn to the actual language? Okay, I'm going to just start with just raising some questions as just working my way through it. If anybody has other things, please feel free. The first comment question I have is defining the term sponsoring restaurant. Yeah, I think we need to do that. Jess, do you have language you can propose, or is there something, how do you want to handle that?
So I actually feel like, Tom's referencing the 2 definitions at the beginning of the actual ordinance itself. And the way that I'm reading it, the sponsoring restaurant and the outdoor dining are almost duplicative of one another to a certain extent. And I think what we need to do is be able to define sponsoring restaurant with, and I have gotten a few questions on what is the difference between retail, outdoor retail versus an outdoor dining. And so I think the difference there is that we want to, outdoor dining reflects food and beverage, right? So we need health to be involved. It means that there's food potentially being served out, food being served outside. I see Bill Mooney's on. We've talked a lot about sort of what can stay outside, what needs to be inside. We've talked a lot about if there's a bar outside, so on and so forth. So I think first and foremost, the outdoor dining piece speaks to food and beverage specifically versus retail. I think retail can go through encroachment permit or can go through a special event permit. But my thoughts are restaurants, cafes, coffee shops, kiosks, stalls. But I think that we need to delineate, and we can work with Brian in the law department, what goes under that sponsoring restaurant versus what goes out under the outdoor dining. I want to make sure that they're not duplicative in any way, shape, or form.
So David and Josh, I know you raised your hands, but before we get to it, so just to be clear, it has to be a business engaged in foods somehow or other to apply in this ordinance, right? That's the goal?
Correct.
Okay, David, you had a...
Well, I get my question actually leads into that, which is when I look at the regulations and the standards, I get confused because you talk about retail establishments that also fall under permitting through that set of regulations, as well as the outdoor dining, so a sponsoring restaurant. And it's not clear to me when I first read through this, and I read through the outdoor dining ordinance, it made sense. But when I got into the guidelines and standards for outdoor dining, it doesn't also say and retail establishments, or there's a disconnect. And also then what ordinance guides those establishments, the retail establishments? Do we need to be referencing that? And do we need to be looking at that ordinance as well as we redefine all of this?
Well, I'm going to jump in because I think the short answer may be, because I did a lot of revisions on this, that I didn't look at the guidelines, and the guidelines are not updated to reflect this. But is that correct, Chaz?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, and Brian and I can work together with Steve and Brian Baker in zoning, but I think that we, in my mind, and happy for discussion, but in my mind, this ordinance and the guidelines and standards should reflect only outdoor dining and not retail. I think that they're two different animals. They're two different processes. They require two different approval processes. And I think that Bill Mooney might be able to weigh in as well from a health standpoint, in the sense of sort of that process, it looks different for both of those pieces.
Okay, that's great then, because I read through this, your guidelines and standards for outdoor dining, and was confused by that.
Okay,
because
so we
I
need to
didn't feel
align
like-
them.
Yeah, I didn't feel like they aligned. So
Yep.
if they're going to align, we need to look at how that changes, which leads me to my next question is that, do we envision that as being only at a city level approval process, or does the council have to weigh in on making changes to those guidelines and standards as we move forward? And so how does that fit? Because you have an ordinance and then you have guidelines and standards. How do they link together? Who approves that? Who makes those changes? And those were things that I was confused when we first read through it. I have a bunch of other questions too, but we can start with that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in for a second. Just generally, the way I'm looking at this is we're just approaching looking at the ordinance now. The guidelines are based upon that ordinance, and they'll be developed by staff. Now, that said, we should make sure we're comfortable with it, and anything really important should be in the ordinance, but typically that is done by staff. Brian's shaking his head here, so I guess I'm right.
Which is great. That's fine. Then I think there are some things that we need to put into the ordinance. And I also think there are some things from a language standpoint that need to reflect the exact language of the ordinance in the guidelines.
Yeah, I would not look at the guidelines tonight.
Okay, that's fine. They were sent in the packet.
Yeah, I
so
know.
used them as a reference point, looking back and forth between.
So I
them.
think, yeah, so we wanted to, the reason why we added the guidelines and standards is because the original ordinance reflected so many of the nuanced requirements for enforcement. And we didn't want the committee to think that we had forgotten those things or that those things were not important. So we wanted to make sure that you felt comfortable with the fact that, one, they're in guidance and standards, and that, two, that those nuanced pieces are in that document, that it's not just being excluded from the ordinance itself, and that we wouldn't be looking to enforce those pieces.
That's great. As you go forward, then looking as we go forward, and then you go forward in developing the guidelines and standards, some suggestions that I have real quickly is I think you need to reference some of the code, where that comes from within the code. So if it's from a specific section, it should go there, because again, we get into that situation where people may not go look at the city code and realize that there's more, there's more from a ordinance standpoint as well. And that
So-
would be
Right.
So just to respond real quick, David. So the changes, there's a lot of changes that were made. There were changes that were made to the ordinance. They need to be updated in the guidelines. I think one of the helpful things that we can do once this process is all done is once these are all finalized, we can put a link up on one of the pages not only the application where the company or restaurant would go for the application, but perhaps on a specific portion of the city website where somebody only has to click on a web link and it'll immediately take you to the ordinance. And you can only click on a web link and it'll immediately take you to the guidelines. We can do that. We can do that to make it easier on people, but you are right. I think once we start to update the regulations and make it sync up, that we should probably cite to specific portions of the ordinance, or at least notify them that this is where you have to go to take a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
And
Appreciate
for ease of use, would we be comfortable updating the guidelines and standards using footnotes or endnotes so that basically the reference is there? Brian, do you think that would be appropriate?
I certainly think that we could use footnote, whatever is easier for people, footnotes or endnotes. I mean, you can all see from the guidelines that it's not incredibly dense in terms of, single line space, very difficult to find out where the footnotes or endnotes would be. Plus, if there's a footnote or endnote, it's going to immediately draw someone's attention, and then they're going to know to have to go back to the document and find it if they didn't see it the first time. But I think it's probably better to use endnotes or footnotes in the guidelines, as opposed to trying to say at the end of a sentence, see section, whatever, it might be missed a
Well,
lot
it might
easier.
also be handy if they hot link at that point as well.
We can certainly do that as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Josh, you had a comment.
Yeah, I realize that, coming a little late to the party here, but in the original legislation at the state level, do they use the term sponsoring restaurant, or is that a term that we just made up?
That's a term that so the terminology from the older ordinance is slightly different than the sponsoring restaurant. Sponsoring restaurant is not terminology that they used in the original executive order and legislation. I can't remember exactly what the wording was, but we can go back and use the wording and also look at the definition so that it has some consistency there. I think that's something that makes sense.
I think the consistency, and I don't know what you think about it, but I do think that consistency at both the state law level and the ordinance level is going to make it easier to track, especially if we need, if there's additional funding that comes down the pike related to,
It's a good point. It's a really good point.
Yeah. I just don't, forgive me for having not taken a look at the enabling legislation that sort of kicked the ball off in the first place. But I do think that that's something we're going to want to think about. I also saw in section 45-30B, there's Tom, is this your note where it says used for outdoor activities, and it says, what does this mean?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. I agree. I don't know. I'm hesitant about when there are vague terms that I don't know what they mean, because either we're defining them or use something that's easy for everybody to understand. When I see the words outdoor activities, I assume it means reasonable activities that would be reasonably done or exercised by a restaurant that has outdoor services. I'm not, I don't know if like, for example, like there are other activities, like, there are restaurants that have music. There are and that could be reasonably construed as an outdoor activity, but I don't know.
Yeah.
So we talked oh, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
No, I was just saying, one of the things we've got to address.
Yeah, so I think
I
my
agree with Tom, is what I'm
recommendation,
saying.
yeah, so I think my recommendation on that is that it got adopted from not that I was laughing with Tom, but I was saying that was the language that got adopted from the outdoor dining ordinance. That was the original outdoor dining ordinance, which is why we're rewriting the outdoor dining ordinance, because there's probably language in there that's a little loose. So I think that, I think one, it's too vague, and two, it's repetitive in nature. I think if we delineate sort of what we mean with the definitions, then we should be comfortable with being able to just actually cross strike that terminology, outdoor activities. And I think you're absolutely right. It's important to note that if there's all of the outdoor activities should then be permitted through the proper processes, and that wouldn't necessarily be an outdoor dining permit. Outdoor dining permit
Right.
means that the restaurant can serve patrons on their patio, not that they can have a band, have a bar, have
This is what I'm
a
talking about.
cornhole tournament. That doesn't, I don't think that that's where we want to go here.
No,
No, and
and the thing
Ju-
that oh, sorry, Brian.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Josh. Jessica's right. I pulled up Executive Order 7MM, which is the local approval process. And the way that the state, when Governor Lamont signed Executive Order 7MM, it allowed restaurants and retailers to open while promoting social distancing by moving their businesses outside. And so I think that language specifically that you and Tom are discussing is something that was probably in the earlier revision of our ordinance, and was not removed because, as you can see, as Jessica's explained, we're trying to tailor this ordinance specifically to one of the two, to the restaurants and not the retailers. And Lamont was doing this for both restaurants and retailers because of the impact of COVID.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mean, it's not, I'm not disagreeing with his intent. I'm just saying that
Right.
the one thing that I'm thinking about a lot, and I you know, for all the other lawyers on this call, I'm worried about dumb litigation. And, you know, some renegade restaurant owner says, well, why can't I do this? It's an outdoor activity. And now, you know, and now corp counsel and outside counsel could be dealing with a whole dumb lawsuit, you know, that ends up getting negative publicity or whatever. And all because we just haven't specifically defined things. I also do think that when we talk about violations, and I realize this is a little later on, this is 4532A. I am wondering, I just wrote a note on the side, or basically, are all violations created equal? You know, because it says that any violation shall be subject to a fine of $250 for each violation. But I have no idea if there's any discretion depending on the scale of the violation. It doesn't seem like there is based on this language.
There isn't
Other than to say that the director of planning and zoning can revoke a permit.
Right. Brian, is that something you can answer?
So the way that the language is currently drafted, there is no discretion. Any violation of this ordinance is subject to a $250 fine per violation, and each day is a separate violation. There is no discretion in that. That is something that the committee can talk about. I think if we change it from shall to may, I think it's going to get a lot more complicated. I think it's easy. The ordinance becomes simpler and easier to understand if we leave it as there is no discretion. A violation is a violation. You had the ordinance, you had the regulations, you have to follow it. But if that's not what you guys want to do, it's just going to make it more complicated if it changes from shall to may.
Yeah, Josh, I left Dominique had raised.
That's what I was about to say. I was about to say I'm lowering my hand here.
Okay.
Do you mind if I respond to just two things? I just pulled up
Sure.
Executive Order 7MM. So the way in which it reads for the outdoor dining, it's outdoor dining and retail, as Brian had said, but it says approval or permit for outdoor food and beverage service, outdoor displays of goods or COVID-19 signage. So obviously the food and beverage service is the piece that we're talking about here with the outdoor dining. And then it also speaks to outdoor activities, and their definition of outdoor activities is that outdoor activities shall not be deemed to include live entertainment, provided that nothing in this order shall be deemed to prohibit an independent approval of live entertainment pursuant to local regulation.
I would literally copy that language and put it in.
Okay.
Just copy it.
Yeah.
Unless anyone feels it should be different.
We'll take a look. Dominic.
Thank you, Tom. I think that my questions kind of dovetail, but it's about the idea of if I'm a bar owner and I do not serve food, is there anything in this proposed ordinance that anybody can see that would be an issue that would muddy the waters? Or is it clear enough to state, like, if you don't serve food, this does not apply to you?
So the police department feels really strongly that food and beverage should really go together regardless of what the timing of the day is and what the situation is. So they feel really strongly that if you are to order a drink, that you then have food accompany that drink. And the thought is that we don't necessarily want in the city to sponsor and permit outdoor bars. And so, you know, after a certain point in time during the day, we don't necessarily want people to have dinner in one place and then go to another place and sort of sit on the patio and drink, you know, for hours on end. And I think that a lot of that came from a lot of the things that we learned during COVID and what we saw during COVID. So it's been really clear from the police department that they are in favor of the guidelines and standards, making sure that that actual particular language is in there. They do not want, we asked the question of should we allow people to have a drink without food up to a certain point in the time during the day, right? And their response was no, if you're ordering drinks, we really feel like food should be accompanying those drinks. So police department feels really strongly about that one.
I can understand, especially with what we heard. And I appreciate that because I did see in the standards, you know, that you need to have like a liquor permit, but that I just wasn't sure if some would misconstrue these standards as applying to them if they were only an alcohol only establishment. I don't think so, but I just wanted to hear from you all what you thought.
Well, I think that brings home the point that the definition of sponsoring restaurant or whatever it is has to be very clear.
Absolutely. That's the dovetail for me. Yeah.
There are businesses, just to be transparent and clear about it, there are businesses in the city of Norwalk that have what they call a cafe license. And the cafe license allows them to serve liquor without having a full operating kitchen. So we would definitely we need to be sure that we understand that if food needs to accompany the drink, that those restaurants, those cafe licensed establishments would need to be able to come to a way to be able to serve food to their patrons if they had outdoor dining. There are not a lot of cafe liquor permits in the city, from my understanding, and Bill, you may know more than I do, but I haven't seen a lot of establishments with those type of licenses, but I want to be clear that may come up as part of some of the comments that we hear about.
You done, Dominique?
I think so. I just had another general question about the standards, but I can wait till the end.
Then Nora, then David.
So a couple of things quickly. So first of all, would I be correct in assuming that there is a restaurant permit issued by the city that is already defined as a restaurant permit? So can't we just define restaurant as a business that holds a restaurant permit?
There are different types of licenses that are issued by the city. So one could be a food beverage restaurant, but the other is a cafe license as well. So there are a few different nuances, but we can make them, we can reference those as well and make sure that they're aligned. But more times than not, the planning department would do an approval based on zoning, which is based on the underlying zoning of the parcel. And then the building department would approve a building certificate based on inspection of the actual nuance, you know, the electrical, plumbing, heating, and so on and so forth. So I think that we do need to have reference to what we exactly mean in this particular ordinance. I don't think we can depend on the different departments to be able to give that to us or to be able to regulate that in the ordinance's place.
Well, I guess maybe what I'm referring to is the food beverage license. I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying is the police department does not want anyone who doesn't hold the food beverage license to have outdoor dining. Is that correct?
That's not correct. So they're not referencing the permit itself. They're just referencing the actual activity that will happen on the patio itself.
Right. But what I'm saying is, as a practical matter, if we're requiring that the activity on the patio have the ability to serve both food or to serve food, then someone who doesn't have a license allowing them to serve food would not be able to get an outdoor dining permit.
But if they have a cafe license, then they would be able to serve alcohol and a certain type of food, but they wouldn't actually be serving out of a full kitchen.
Right, but and so that's, I guess, is my question is, would the amount of food that you can serve with a capital license be sufficient for the purposes of the police department?
And I think that's what we need to, that's partly what we need to make sure in the guidelines and standards is laid out. So
Okay.
I think
'Cause it would
different
just-
departments have different feelings on that as well. So there are different comfort levels.
And that's fine. It would make sense to me that the ordinance in the definition of restaurant have a definition that refers to whatever levels of license or permit we sort of, is determined to be appropriate, because that would be the simplest way to my mind of defining what a restaurant is. You want to define.
Nora, to your point, I think it'd also be helpful if a person who is a restaurant in Norwalk knew what applied to them, can just look at the same thing in another ordinance, right?
Right, that's exactly. Like you need to use the terminology that's familiar to the people who are operating the businesses. So I think that would be the by far the clearest way to do it, is just to decide what fits in there and define it that way.
Yeah.
The other sort of smaller point I had, I was confused by the concept of directly contiguous. I understand directly adjacent, but directly contiguous, I think is sort of a bit of an oxymoron, or could be a bit of an oxymoron. So this gets into the same section with the outdoor activities. I think that's confusing for people. So I assume that by contiguous, you mean near enough to the restaurant, even if it's not directly next to it. I just think there might be a clearer way to say, if there's some limit intended to be set there, I don't know what that is on the basis of
I thought
that
you were
language.
talking about sidewalks or parking lots. That's what I thought it said, but I don't know.
Yeah, so it's a direct transfer from what was passed in legislation and what was passed in the executive order. So basically the first piece of that, which is adjacent to the storefront, means a sidewalk, or it means directly in front of your particular building. Contiguous is that the executive order and that the legislation allowed for a restaurant to extend their outdoor dining to the neighboring business if they got the neighboring business's approval. We want it to read contiguous because we don't necessarily want a restaurant running food up and down the street 3 or 4 businesses down the road, right? So, and I see Bill's nodding his head that the temperature of the food and so on and so forth is important. So what we don't want it to read that if you get the approval of a business that you can set your outdoor dining up in front of that storefront, regardless if it's retail or not, because we don't want the restaurateur running back and forth. So it really needs to be that it's a neighboring business to your business that is a restaurant in which you have outdoor dining.
And I totally understand that conceptually. I'm just saying that I don't think the language directly contiguous is clear, in part because, again, what if it is being defined in opposition to adjacent? So presumably then it means something that is not adjacent. So is it 1 storefront down? Is it 2 storefronts down? Is it across the street? Like what? I think we need a clear perimeter for that, because the concept just is not clear to me from that language.
So I think contiguous means that your patio needs to be directly adjacent to your storefront, and that contiguous means that you need to have 1 dining area and not 2 separate dining areas, that your fenced in area for your dining is 1 large area and not 2 separate areas that are 2 separate, distinct, independent dining areas, if that makes sense.
That's
But I hear,
not at all.
but I hear what you're
That's
saying about
not at all what I got from that language at all.
Okay.
That is definitely not what I took away from that language. So I just think we need, like, if that's what you're saying, like it needs to be, a single area. Like there just needs to be a clear way to explain that to folks.
Okay.
All right, Nora, I want to move. Tom hasn't spoken yet, so I'm going to have.
Yeah, I yield to Tom for the
Go
moment.
ahead, Tom. Tom, you muted.
As long as he unmutes.
No, that's just
What
chance.
else is new? And why shouldn't we end the year like we started the year? I have a question for Jess about what the police department was saying about serving food or someone not eating. I'm not so sure I understand what they were trying to convey, that they don't want people going to a restaurant and not eating. Is that what they were saying?
Right. So they're concerned that after a certain hour on like a Friday or a Saturday, for example, hypothetically, right? On a Friday or a Saturday, let's say after 9 o'clock, people are going to go out to do outdoor dining, but they're not going to do the dining part. They're only going to have the alcoholic drink part. And so what they're trying to do, in my understanding, is basically work around the fact that we do not want and address the fact that we don't want outdoor bars in the city of Norwalk, where we don't want people going out at 9 or 10 or 11, ordering drinks one after the other without really having the outdoor dining experience. So I believe that's what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we can regulate that by ordinance. I think that's something we should, I don't know. I wouldn't want to get called to that one. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know, the bar has to regulate themselves, you know, we can't do it all for them. That's my.
I think it's a really good point on the enforcement piece too, because we're having to enforce each of these pieces through, and actually it's a big lift for health and a big lift for, you know, Bill's team and being able to kind of regulate and enforce all of those things. So I think it's definitely something that we need to talk about. I also
a lot of overtime for Mr. Mooney. Want you to come on out. This guy's eating over here. So
well, if I could talk, I mean, part of the problem is that we don't want people just having 4 guys drinking beers around some nachos. We want to, kind of avoid that as much as possible. It gets to be a slippery slope between, you know, what's a meal and appetizers. So it's hard to really kind of nail it down, but it's important to do so.
Okay.
I don't know what to say. It seems very, when you talk about slippery slopes, I think it is. And I don't know. I don't know how we can craft an ordinance to tell a guy that, okay, you're not hungry. Okay, you have to leave. I mean, I don't know what to say.
Well, there's also sort of the exercise of ordering the least expensive thing on the menu to have it sit on the table while having drinks around it as well, right? So there's sort of a, I don't know how you regulate or enforce that either, in the sense of it sort of checks the box, but I don't think that's really what we're trying to achieve.
And I also, you know what, to try to make an ordinance or any law or statute fit everything, I mean, is almost virtually impossible. So
we can't.
You know, I don't think, you know.
Well, we're trying to provide service is the wrong word. We're trying to help out the restaurants, right? And so we're not going to be able to solve every problem, right? Anyway, unless you have any questions, I think, David, you were next, right?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I kind of agree with Mr. Keegan on this too. I think this is a really tough one to navigate because of just that reason. You know, the guys want to order a plate of nachos and they want to drink beers. I don't know. I don't know how we do that and serve everyone at that point, but that's it. I've got a lot of little things, just little questions here. Can I go through a bunch of them right now? Just
actually, David, hold that thought for a minute, because I just want to get to the general concept questions, and then we come back and talk about how we're going to.
I do have a general, sort of a general concept question about this. How does this ordinance dovetail into what we did go through with the pandemic, where we carved out sections of the street? We put up the Jersey barriers or the K-rails, and we said, you know, you can have this section to do outdoor dining, or as it sort of turned out, it became the walkway. But, you know, where are we allowing for the provision for that, which is a potential expectation, which we've talked about in this committee before, about these ideas of the what are they called, the parklets, or the idea of being able to, you know, permit that curb area, and then how this ordinance extends to that when someone does that. And I don't see any of that within this ordinance. So that's a question, because if you look at 4531C, where we start to talk about any damage to public right of way or sidewalk, I immediately started thinking about, you know, as you're calling it right now, the sponsoring restaurant, are they gonna, if their choice is to put a parklet in, could they also choose to rent K-rails from the city at that point to do that? I mean, how does this ordinance tie in and fit to that in a more general sense? So that's my more
Right.
general question. You do have a bunch of sort of specific things.
So the bigger, broader, universal answer to that is that we want to move forward with some sort of, we would like to be able to explore moving forward with some sort of parklet program. What we realize is that it's really a building block exercise, and unless we actually address outdoor dining ordinance first, that even if we built a parklet program, we didn't really have a foundation that the parklet program could sit appropriately on, because the outdoor dining ordinance was so antiquated. So we took a step back from parklets. We're addressing outdoor dining first and foremost. So just in the sense of thinking about the sequencing of these pieces, to answer your question, you're not going to see reference to parklets or programs in the actual ordinance, but in the very last section of the guidelines and standards, we included a section that says other outdoor dining programs. And it says the city of Norwalk may from time to time introduce new outdoor dining programs. Newly introduced programs will be accompanied by guidelines and standards and have a separate permitting process.
Which I understand, but we don't reference anything right now. It means we have to come back to this ordinance and talk about this activity in the right of way. Because I think that's going to be another.
I'm not sure that's.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, because the Department of Public Works gives encroachment permits all the time, right?
So this would fall, then that would fall under an encroachment permit from Department of Public Works.
That's right, because it would be a right of.
Doesn't have to discuss that at all.
I think that it would go through a separate process where you would be using encroachment for the right of way, but that you would also need to meet the outdoor dining regulations. So I think it would be the outdoor dining guidance and standards with an additional sort of a whole additional section to it that basically is the liability and the insurance and the requirements for being able to establish your outdoor dining on the actual right of way, which is on the roadway. So I think we would need to address it in a different way.
I guess then it feeds into my next question, which is, does that affect adjacent and contiguous? Because you're now putting sidewalk right away between the establishment and the right of way encroachment. And does that, or do we need to address that, or am I gilding the lily at that point?
No, I think it's actually a really good point, because the original outdoor dining ordinance spoke to, I think it's an excellent point, because the original outdoor dining ordinance spoke to the fact that you could only have outdoor dining adjacent to your storefront, and you couldn't allow for table to be near your storefront, a 4-foot sidewalk, and then tables to be near the sidewalk, or excuse me, the roadway. And we tried to address that through the ordinance update. So I think I think it's an excellent flag. And I think, Brian and I will go through it and make sure that it addresses that. I think it's a really, really good point. Because one of the things we're trying to do is ensure that that wasn't the language that was, that wasn't the governing language on the location of the actual dining.
Well, this becomes, when we start parsing out the words adjacent and contiguous, we get into that if we move into the potential of somebody in the right of way and having, a 6-foot gap between their storefront and the dining.
Right. That's a good point.
But I think even without the parklet discussion, it's also really important, because if your sidewalk is wide enough, then it would be nice to be able to have the flexibility to work around trees and fire hydrants to be able to keep those areas clear and be able to set your tables and chairs up appropriately,
This also
right?
gets
So
into
sort of,
whether if it's in a parking lot and they choose to do the dining on the other end of the parking lot for whatever reason. I mean, does that play into it? I mean, the way the ordinance is written right now, I don't know. I mean, it begs the question, so.
I don't think it plays into that, but it plays into the language of what barrier is required and how the barrier needs to be set up. For example, if your dining is adjacent to your storefront, then you may have sort of like you may have a 3-sided or 2-sided barrier, but if you do adjacent to and near the curb, then we would need to sort of have a different barrier language in there to be able to allow for that.
People's images have changed on my screen, so I
I
thought
think
it was.
Dominique was first.
I think Dominique, then Nora. But you keep moving around on me. I can't keep track.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Tom. David, thank you. You asked my parklet question as well. I had that. I appreciate it. The other question I had, Jess, was just looking through the standards again, just generally. Really great specific examples about the right of way, what would need to be changed in the event of a parade or something like that. And I just am thinking, because it says if you've already been through this process, if I understand correctly, you don't have to do it again if you're a restaurant. That's right? I'm getting that right?
So you have to go through it annually. You need to apply
Annually.
annually for the permit itself.
Even if you have one now.
Correct. So it's per,
Okay, got
so
it.
our outdoor dining season is from April the 1st until November the 30th. I
Got it.
believe those are the dates that we put in here. And there's reference that say that you need to apply annually for your permit, right? So
Okay.
you need to be able to, now if your patio hasn't changed, then you can submit the same plan, but you need to go
Okay, got
through the process for the updated outdoor dining season.
And that's the part that says via a site plan approval. That's the thing you can submit if you haven't changed. Is that right?
Right. So that's a different, so for example, so the difference is that some restaurants go through the site plan approval and they show outdoor dining on their site plan. And basically when they get approved for that, it means that they don't need to continuously go through the process, that it was approved as part of their use as a restaurant, as part of their site plan. So that basically is a whole encompassing of the way in which they use their parcel or their lot, right? And then if you're not in that category, then you're in the category where you didn't get a site plan approval that said continuously how you would use your parcel and your location. And that's where you need to come to us and be able to lay out your plan and lay out the way in which you're sort of moving forward. And I see Josh is nodding his head at Josh. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think, but for this outdoor dining in special circumstances, I think this would fall outside the normal site plan review that would normally be part of the zoning application process.
So we were picturing like an example, an example might be an Oak and Almond where the outdoor dining has been approved as part of the site plan. So would we need an Oak and Almond to come in each year and basically apply for the permitting of outdoor dining when we know that that's sort of an established area that they've always used? So that was really where we're trying to, just as an example.
That's great. I appreciate that example too, is because it's such a good one visually. For me too, it's just a matter of if I'm a restaurant and these standards are changing every year, because they could hypothetically, based on what's working, what's not. That seems like it's going to be a clear process because it has to be done annually. I mean, that's just my opinion of it.
Well, and that's partly why we wanted to tease out the guidelines and standards, because we've learned so much over the last couple of years and we want to be able to be responsive. We want to be able to open up outdoor dining and make it more business friendly, but we also don't want to get in a position where we're not comfortable with what's happening or how it's happening. And so partly being able to peel away and build a guidelines and a standard document that has all that nuanced information in it allows us the flexibility from a staff level to be more responsive, to be able to change the way in which those regulations are working. So that was the thought in trying to peel those two pieces apart and the way in which they would act together and sort of function in a parallel.
Thank you, Ms. Vanchuk. I appreciate it. And I'll just say, you know, to Mr. Keegan's point, maybe nacho sales will go up because of this, but I just know I've heard from like South Norwalk residents saying that they felt their neighborhood kind of turned into a party zone over COVID. So I understand that. I know you're trying to respond to that as well too. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, Nora?
So actually, I respond to the same point that Mr. Keegan made. I did not even understand that was sort of an intent here, because I find that to be, I'm highly skeptical that that's a workable solution. I can't imagine how enforcement is going to police whether every table has ordered an adequate amount of food in ratio to their alcohol. I would think that if the problem we're trying to get at is too much noise and too much drinking too late at night, that we simply cut the outdoor dining off at, I don't know, 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10 o'clock, which is, you know, at what period of time do people typically stop ordering large amounts of food and switch to ordering primarily large amounts of alcohol? That strikes me as a much more effective way of getting at this. That's not going to entangle people in really complex and unpleasant, and quite frankly, going to thoroughly piss off customers and restaurateurs kind of enforcement.
Right. And I think so I totally agree with you. And I think there may be a way to distinguish between a restaurant versus a bar based on what they serve and what their business type is. And I'm wondering, you know, if we can work with police on that too, right? Sort of how do you, and I don't know what the answer is, but there's definitely a distinction between a cafe versus a restaurant versus a bar. And so I think we have a good sense of that. But again, you know,
well,
I'm
and
sure
that's
that
what
there are arguments that could lend themselves to either direction as well.
Well, and that's going to be the issue. So if we are simply requiring that food be available, then that makes sense. But if the expectation is that somehow the restaurant is going to enforce an adequate amount of food being ordered, then that doesn't make sense. So with that, I think it's clarified what the goal is, right? So I think, you know, if we want to say it's restaurants only, that's great. Then again, you have to have a full menu. I mean, again, that's a common thing you see lots of places. You know, anyone who wants to do this must have a full menu available. Fine. But that's, I think, as far as we're likely to be able to go effectively.
Right. And Bill, a question for you. If we were to include language like that, would we be able to work with planning and zoning and then the Department of Health to be able to determine what the full menu, what discretion on what full menu is, or what is your thought on that?
Well, it's a full menu. I mean, a class 3 restaurant is kind of like a full menu. A class 2 is sort of like a McDonald's where you order food, you can consume it within 4 hours. So it gets into some kind of gray areas with that. You know, it's going to be really hard to kind of tailor something to it. Not that it's not impossible, but it's just going to be difficult to do that. I mean, you could use the word full service, but you know, that's kind of vague as well. So I think you'd have to probably look at it. We could talk about it and see if we could narrow it down where something that's workable for everybody. I'd be glad to do that. But it's definitely going to require some work.
Well, again, and I'm not suggesting we invent a new term. What I'm really trying to say is I think we should be using whatever terms we currently use. So it sounds like class 3 and class 2, and the question is, does class 2 qualify? But we should be using whatever terminology already exists that implies within it the ability to do a full meal. I definitely don't want to add any more terms. I think the whole point of this is to use as much as possible only existing terms.
Yeah, no, it's good. I appreciate the feedback.
Josh?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I want to add, just based on Tom's point and just something to think about in terms of, you know, restaurants and the business community is there is, without food, you know, being served with alcohol, I mean, restaurants have a legal obligation and bars have a legal obligation to make sure that they are not serving people who are overly drunk, who should not be served, and exposes them to legal liability under a dram shop action. And as someone who works at a firm that has prosecuted dram shop actions, no business wants to be on the back end of that, because that, you know, exposes them. It puts the business in real trouble. And obviously, the reasons an action like that happens is because someone was overserved and something terrible has happened. So one of the things about, you know, making sure that food being served with alcohol is to actually try and mitigate that, to lessen the possibility. And because it's in an outdoor setting, I mean, what happens if someone's overserved, they didn't have anything to eat, and then they just walk into the street? Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I think that something I just want to be very careful about in terms, you know, I don't want this to foment conditions that would expose restaurants, you know, to having patrons who had too much alcohol in light of the fact that they didn't have to also have food.
Right. I think the other piece too that the police were concerned about was also the ability to access the crowd over the outdoor dining barrier that was established on Washington and sort of the contiguous barrier that was in place, which caused them difficulty in being able to kind of regulate and enforce behavior. And so, you know, with the outdoor dining ordinance that we're talking about, we talked about parklets, but those would be one-off approvals per restaurant as opposed to just one barrier along, you know, a huge stretch. And so, you know, I think the other piece too is that we need to be mindful that that's not going to be the actual logistical setup, operating setup moving forward as well. So I want to put that out there.
So as I'm listening to this, I'm seeing like the big issue is our definition of restaurant. Right? And that's, I think, the number one thing we all seem to come back to, you know, how do we define that? How do we make it, you know, something that's to the extent possible, consistent with how we use the rest of the city. So I think that's a key point we need to focus on. The second key point I'm hearing is, what does it mean, contiguous or adjacent? How do we define that, including consideration of parklets? I'm not hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're really going to be in a position to move this to public hearing next meeting. Just because I think there are enough little open issues. And I think, Jess, your timing is such that we can defer this until, you know, we can revise it, bring it up in January, and have time in a public hearing to do that in February, right?
And we can look, and we can also, so if we were to talk about it in January and you were to vote on it in February, we would be able to take it to Common Council in February, which would then give us about probably 4 to 5, you know, it'd be nice to have 4 to 5 weeks to have to have the ordinance in place so that restaurants can use the online form to be able to apply. So, you know, it would be, I think that timeline is fine. And I would rather address these items and work with Brian and legal and some of the different departments to be able to get to the right place on this so everyone's comfortable. And as long as if we have the goal, or the commission has the goal of being able to vote on it in February, then I think we would be able to have that timeline in place. You know, not only do we want to meet the March 31st timeline, but we also want to give a few weeks for the restaurants to be able to read the ordinance, understand what the ordinance is, understand the guidelines and the standards, and be able to apply online so that they're in place. To a large extent, the restaurants don't necessarily have outdoor dining up and running on April the 1st, right? It's still be a little chilly, but at the same time, you know, we want to be respectful of our outdoor dining season. And also, you know, as much as we all dislike it, we're still sort of in COVID situation. And so we need to be in a position where we're really supporting the small business and the restaurants out there and making sure that they understand what the regulations are and what the ordinance is, and be able to help them navigate that. So I think that's a very, very long answer, Tom, and I apologize for that. But
well, no, the answer is what I thought in terms of
I
timing.
think February approval is okay.
And the other, just a couple other things. I know some people have some other comments. The small niche we can send to Brian. And I'm speaking for the chair here, but she's not here, so I can do that. I think we can rework this based upon the comments I've heard and we've all heard. You'd also raised the question, was David, I guess, whoever raised the one about the violations. I think maybe you, Josh, raised that one. We can take a look at that section. We'll just have to see how that works. I mean, sometimes, you know, it may be harder to parse new material or immaterial violations. So we'll just have to see. We'll look at some of the language on that. Are there any other big, more conceptual issues we ought to be thinking about, or just leave it to small ones and we can work on that? David, your hand's up.
Just quick. I have a bunch of small ones, but I can talk with Brian and you about that offline, and we could talk about that. But I did have a question, and this is it's in the violations section that are where you have the blue line. I'm assuming that's added language, correct, Brian? Yeah, section 4, sorry, 45-34. So
which one was that?
Where you say has had 2 or more violations, are we talking about active violations at that point? Or are we talking about having had any violations over that period of time?
Where are we, David?
This is the top of page 2.
4530C4.
4530C4.
Brian, it's the language you added, I guess, from the other ordinance.
It's the last line of.
Oh, yeah, I see. 2 or more violations. That would be, this is when somebody's applying for the permit, so they would be past violations.
So they would be past violations, so over time. Okay, that was all. That was just.
And it's also a may, just that gives more comfort. May turn it down.
Yeah, the other piece that I wanted to add in there, and I was going to talk to Brian about it, was property tax. We want to make sure that everyone is up on property tax before we're offering outdoor dining permits to folks as well. So I think that's something in addition to the violation piece that we need to add.
I thought that was there, but we make sure that's in there.
That leads me to a question though, up in 4530B, and it's repeated again in another spot, but that's the spot I flagged, which is it may be permitted on lots, zoning lots, street faces or yards. Doesn't that need to say a tax lot or a zoning lot? Those are the two, aren't those the two definitions in our?
I had a question about that, David. I had a question myself about that language. I think
Lots
maybe
is a vague term, but I believe they're tax lots or zoning lots are the two.
Right, and that
different-
language came directly again from Executive Order 7MM, where they referenced that. So we have the ability to change that language, but again, we carried it right over from the executive order and the legislation to be
So we just need to
consistent.
look and make sure that we're lining it up based on what our, how we define our
Definitions are.
different levels of property.
Yeah, I don't know why we don't use the word property, but I think we should look at that because I'm not a real estate guy. So, all right. So any other comments? Everybody okay with that approach? Josh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only small thing I would note, and something in the guidelines, is there's a note about outdoor heaters being banned in the outdoor dining area. I don't know where that, I don't know what, I don't understand the genesis of that, because there are many, many restaurants that have outdoor heaters. And so I just, that's not in the ordinance, it's in the guidelines. I
it's in
just
the
don't
guidelines.
understand the genesis of this now.
Yeah.
I'm looking at, I think it's page.
Yes, you know what it is, right?
Yep,
5.
I do. Yep, we can look at that for sure.
It's a
Yeah.
good point, Joe. Yeah, a lot of places have it.
There's if you see places
General
that have,
outdoor dining rules and regulations. I understand not putting it under a tent,
Mhm.
but that's not what this says. Number
there's a whole
7.
piece, yeah, there's a whole
Um,
piece of code and a whole piece of, there's a whole piece of code and a whole piece of legislation that basically dictates and guides heating devices and the way in which the propane needs to be set up or the electrical needs to be set up and so on and so forth. So I think more than anything, we need to reference the code and reg that goes along with that. And that's part of, those are comments that shouldn't be hard and fast rules of no heating devices, but we need to work with the fire marshal to do that. So point taken, just making a note of it now that we'll look at it.
Yeah, that's,
But I
otherwise
have
I'm
it,
good.
I have it here in the guidelines and standards. I found it here. Yep.
Is the plan for us to take a look at revised guidelines also in January as well, so that we see the link or the potential link between those?
Again,
I will have them, I'll have them updated so that you can see the relationship between them and make sure that they're aligned.
Great, thank you, appreciate that.
all right. Any other comments now? Otherwise, if you have comments, any needs, send them to Lisa and Brian. And we'll move on. Okay, then let's move on to new business, which is to discuss and vote on Chapter 45, Article 2, Sale and Dispensing of Food and Drink, Section 21, Definitions, Food Handling Establishment. Matt, are you handling that, or is it, who's handling that? Brian, are you doing then?
I don't believe it's me.
Oh,
I'm here.
okay. Brian?
I'm more than happy to do that if Matt isn't. Hold on one second. So this is my on speaker. Hold on.
Yeah, you are.
I'm off mute. Thank you. This is.
Oh, is this the cottage? I'm sorry. Is this a
um,
cottage food line? I'm sorry that I.
It is.
Yes, Matt, it is.
Oh, I apologize. I thought I heard a different title. Yes, I'm happy to help out with that, Tom. And sorry, Brian, for the confusion. Yes, so the city received a letter from a nonprofit organization called the Institute for Justice. And they, I guess, handle, they're not based in Connecticut, but they handle a range of issues nationally. I think the genesis of this issue was that there was an article in one of the Connecticut newspapers about cottage foods. Cottage foods are defined more or less as cooking in your own house, such as jams, jellies, and selling that material. And that's regulated by the state of Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection. And there's kind of financial limits. You can only sell up to a certain amount, but in essence, you're able to make some kind of home products and sell them. What started with, there's a newspaper article about them that had a sentence that said that Norwalk and I believe Danbury were the only two states in Connecticut that prohibited cottage foods in their towns. I don't know. I don't believe that statement is factually accurate. The truth is our ordinances don't really discuss cottage foods. So it's quite honestly, the jury's still out, just hasn't really come up in the city of Norwalk yet. So we don't really explicitly allow them, but we don't explicitly prohibit them either. So either way, this nonprofit organization saw that article, and one of their issues that they advocate for is the cottage food industry. So they requested that we clarify our ordinances to show that cottage foods are allowed. To be fair to them, the cottage foods are regulated by the state of Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection, as I said, and they are expressly permitted. So quite honestly, the city of Norwalk cannot ban them, even if we wanted to. And I don't think, I don't know of any. But I'll defer to you, your office, on the policy reasons. But again, actually, we can't ban them. But the proposed ordinance is just a clarification measure that would more explicitly allow them in the city of Norwalk. And the other feature is, as we're analyzing this issue and talking with the IJ group, and we were kind of debating for a while because I pointed out that, well, we don't actually ban them, cottage foods, and they thought that we did ban them. One thing that came up, and I think Bill Mooney can speak to this, is that it's not necessarily something that we as a city necessarily want to regulate. The state of Connecticut actually requires permits for them, and in homeowner or cottage food providers must apply to the state of Connecticut, and they actually regulate them. And I think, again, Bill could expound on it, but it might be procedurally and resource sense difficult for him to go into people's houses and monitor them. And I think a lot of the regulations that he usually applies wouldn't really match up well to homeowners in this industry. So the proposed revision, right now, pretty much anyone who does any kind of food business must apply for a local food license from the health department. And food business is defined very broadly as to really include any kind of business with food. The proposed revision to the ordinance will carve out a small exception to food business that says, food handling establishment does not include a cottage food operation that has a valid license pursuant to the Commissioner of Consumer Protection, the state. And in that sense, they won't, they'll still be obligated to go to the state of Connecticut for their license, but it won't necessarily be something that we have to regulate. And it kind of explicitly tells anyone who's looking, who might be in Norwalk interested in cottage foods, that they have an avenue to do so in the city of Norwalk.
So Matt, just to clarify something, you said food business. Did you mean food, the definitional term food handling establishment there?
I did, yes. Yes,
Okay.
food
No,
hand,
that's
yes.
fine. And all right, thank you. Are there any questions or comments on this? And based upon what I can see, there aren't any. Oh, Dominique, sorry.
Thank you very much, Tom. I've met a bunch of these folks at farmers markets, and I know just recently council members Goldstein and Jalski Agner and I met one of these folks at an event in Rowayton. What I understand is that this cottage food industry is limited by where you're zoned, like where your house is in the zoning there. Is that fair to say?
So there would be two issues. So there's kind of two legal aspects to cottage food production. One is the health department, and the other is zoning regulations. IJ Group did not have any issue with the zoning regulations, and to be honest, those are actually handled by the zoning commission, not by your. But so I'm going to refrain myself from opining too much on the city's zoning regulations. All I will say, new regulations are coming down from the state that I think explicitly allow cottage foods in zoning districts. But yes, you're onto something. It's kind of a separate issue that I'd be hesitant to say one way or the other clearly what our zoning regulations say about cottage foods, because it's not necessarily pertinent to the ordinance committee, and I haven't really. Because IJ Group didn't have a problem with it, it was not something that we looked into too seriously, because in their understanding, they are allowed in zoning. So I'm just going to defer to their opinion for now.
Okay, thank you. To me, it just seems like we're making a clearer definition saying that, yes, we would like, if you're interested, we'd like you to continue doing that business in Norwalk. There's no ordinance against it, but then the question remains based upon where these business owners live, whether or not they have to rent kitchen space in Wilton, for example, is what I'm kind of hearing.
I think that you have a point. And again, that's something that could be addressed to the planning and zoning department, but you're onto something that anyone who does that wants to do cottage food should also check their zoning regulations. And I mean, I don't want to guess. I don't think that there is an issue to them according to our zoning regulations, and neither did this nonprofit organization IJ Group. But again, because it wasn't the legally pertinent issue here, I didn't really. I'd hate to put a firm stamp on that, but it doesn't seem to be an issue. But yes, there are. So they're really this is just today. We're mostly for the health department, and to the extent you are nervous about that, it's something that should be looked into, could be looked into. But you'd have to do. They're really two separate trees that you got to shake. And right now we're shaking the health department tree. Another day we could do zoning if anyone so chooses.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put you in a spot there, Matthew. I appreciate it. Yeah. So this is fundamentally to make sure that people know they have to go to the health department. They have to go to the state. But that's the limit to this redefinition or revision of the definition, I should say, right?
Correct. Yes. In terms of health, any kind of health department, that the state will regulate it instead of our local health inspector.
Thank you, Attorney Sapiens. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Any further discussion? No, hearing none. Brian, we want to go to public hearing on this, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'd like to move that the proposed amendment to the definition of food handling establishment as presented to this committee be moved to the public hearing at the next regularly scheduled meeting of this committee in January. All in favor, indicate by raising hand. Okay, it is unanimous. Okay, let's move on. And next item of business is the proposed, let's see, to vote on a proposed change to Chapter 55 for the demolition delay. And we have with us tonight, I guess, Dana Laird, who is Chair of the Historical Commission, as well as Laura Kenny. Laura, you are I guess, I'm not sure your exact title, but you are the staff to the Historical Commission. So who wants to discuss this? Right now, we do have a demolition delay. This would be an extension of the delay, as well as a couple other provisions. The point of tonight is to really introduce the subject. We're not going to vote on it tonight. We're just going to discuss it. So Dana or Laura, whoever wants to take it.
Hi, I'm Dana Laird, Historic Commission Chair, and we are hoping to expand the demolition delay from 120 days, which is our current status, to 180 days to align us more with Westport Stamford. That's the basic thing. We probably want to tune up some other issues along with that. But right now, that's our current concern because things happen so quickly and we're losing a lot of stock, historic stock, and just the character of Norwalk is being lost to this building boom. And Laura, do you have anything to add?
Well, but actually, Laura, before you go on, Dana, why don't you
Okay. Yep.
explain how it currently works? Because, you know, people see 180 days or 120 days and they automatically assume
Right.
it's that long. This really doesn't work that way. Well,
Yeah.
it could, it could, but it doesn't usually. So why don't you talk about how it works?
So buildings over 50 years old do have to notify neighboring properties, and they have to put a notice in the paper. They have to put a notice on the building. And if there are objections from the public, then the demolition delay can be invoked. And so hopefully something can be done in the meantime to possibly save the property. Did I get everything there?
Well, no, the key is 21 days. You have to, and you have to file your notice of
right.
objection within 21 days. If you
Oh, yeah.
don't, then you can go ahead and demolish it. But if you do,
Yeah.
then you have up to 180 days or 120 days, which is in theory time to allow the parties to work for some mutually acceptable solution.
Right. Well, even that 21 days from the notification is tricky too, but it's something to start with.
Josh, I'm sorry. All right, sorry, Dana.
Yeah.
I didn't cut you off. Josh had a
You call me
question.
Josh all the time. Yeah, so basically we're just trying to get some more meat on this ordinance.
Well, let me just say a couple of things, because I'm also on the historical commission, so I can add a couple of things on some of the other changes. The change you see on 55-1 was really because there's such, essentially it can be sort of a constructive demolition where somebody doesn't actually go out and demolish it, but they allow through neglect or otherwise for the building to fall into such a state of repair it falls apart. And that's what a contractor could do. There are also some questions here about notice, or changes for notice. That is because the notice process wasn't really working as well as it might, and the historical commission did not always get the notices in a timely manner. So that's intended to clear that up. Those are the main changes of this. I'm looking at it myself. I'll just throw this out there, is I had some questions about, things of like, what does it mean to demolish? I mean, it's opening up a word about opening a can of worms. There's also a question if somebody lifts a house, say for just flooding purposes, should that be covered? Another key part here that we've talked about is what's an appropriate penalty for somebody who violates this? If it's only, say, $100 a day, you can tear down a house and pay your $180, couple $1,000 and you're done. The model ordinance in Hartford, it's not in Hartford, the state model ordinance, I think, provides for essentially no permits will be issued, building permits will be issued for a period of time if somebody violates this ordinance. So I think it's something we should consider. But anyway, where's their hand first? You moved again, you guys. David?
My very quick one sort of question here is, I understand the 21 days and I understand that the notice provisions, but that doesn't answer the question for me about what the difference is between 180 versus 120. And to me, the question I feel like needs to be answered is what have historical commissions seen, the difference, essentially, what's the difference in effectiveness between 120 and 180?
I can help with this. Just right now, we're undergoing one right now. Someone placed a demolition delay on a property in Norwalk, and within those either 120 days or 180 days, whatever the municipality is set, the municipality, the state, the homeowner all work together to come up with alternatives to demolition. So in some cases, that's coming up with architectural plans, which can take longer for renovation. In the current case, some of the holdup has been, one of the property owners didn't provide an accurate survey. And as a result, we weren't able to work with them in a timely manner to determine renovation options. And so extending the time frame might help with that type of back and forth with engineers and architects in the state and all kind of the different players that are involved in the process.
The sense was
another
that-
thing is, sorry, another thing is to get people to stop thinking about Norwalk as just land to use to put their houses on, not thinking about what is there before. It's just strictly real estate to the developers.
No, I wasn't trying to be callous with the question. What,
No, I'm not trying to,
what
yeah, I'm
Miss-
just
Miss
trying to
Kenny,
make it
Miss
clear.
Kenny said was the answer. I thought she was
Yes,
something along thought what it was, but I just wanted to like hear from someone
of course.
what that was.
Nora? I think you're next.
Couple things. So first, the notice of receipt from the Historical Commission, what is the process by which someone would get that? Because typically in law, a service is considered, complete once it is mailed. So this is actually a somewhat unusual addition to make. And I'm concerned about the logistics of requiring people to get the Historical Commission to provide notice that they have in fact received this document. So how would that work?
We haven't always been getting the notices that demolitions have been filed for. Lately, that's been improving over the past year or so. I've also been sending it to all my commissioners. But when we don't receive something for whatever reason, it's just kind of upsetting, because that's our job, is to know what's going on in town. So. And
I understand that.
we just
So
return.
So Nora, excuse me, you're referring to, I guess it's B5.
Yes.
So as opposed to having certified mail, which would be the normal thing, right?
Right. So I'm asking,
Yeah.
who would be doing this letter of receipt?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's a good point.
Yeah, I do. I respond that I have received the letter when I get these notices.
Yeah, but is there a requirement that you do so? I mean, I'm with Nora. That's not normally the way we do. It's not normally the way we do things, right?
I agree.
Yeah. I'm just worried it could create a whole bunch of hiccups. I mean, if you're the only person who can do that and you're on vacation, or I'm just like, typically if we're going to put something in ordinance, we need an established process. So I'm just a little concerned about that. The second thing, just for my own edification, this applies to any building in Norwalk that's over 50 years old.
Yeah, it does. They do need to do that. And Laura, you can fill in too.
So the Historical Commission, or really anyone in the state, has the option to issue a demo delay for any building over 50 years old in the state. But we spoke to buildings earlier, and in Norwalk, it's only been carried out maybe 10 times. So it's kind of a last resort, and I don't think it's used inappropriately. But yes, it can be applied to any structure that's over 50 years old.
What's just a size limit here, right? Over.
Yeah, so I think there is something that says like
400 square feet, I think it is, or 500.
I think it's 500 square
Oh,
feet.
it's 400. It's
400. Okay.
And so that's geared towards like if someone has a shed in their backyard or something like that, it won't, no one's going to stop them. So there is a size requirement, but it can be carried out for any building over 50 years old. But typically the state will take it more seriously if the building's on some type of historic list, whether it's town, state, or federal.
Okay, no, I honestly am wondering simply because I had my own experience with having to take a house down because it was structurally unsound. And I'm just imagining like my head exploding if someone had come to me and tried to delay that process. So it's interesting. I was unfamiliar with this, and I'm glad to hear that the history of it seems to be that it is being used appropriately. That is good to hear.
Yeah, if the building department or fire department just deems it uninhabitable, that's safety is number one, so,
Yeah, there's an exception for hazardous.
yeah.
Okay, good to hear.
David?
I guess I just want to clarify in my head how this process works. If I'm a property owner, I want to demolish a building, I go to the city, I file for a permit to have the building demolished. Are you then, if it's over 50 years old, are you immediately noticed that that permit was issued or that permit has been applied for?
Yes,
Well, that's what's supposed to happen.
best case scenario.
But we're talking about an internal issue then, the
Right.
city to the historical commission, not necessarily an outside party bringing action within 21 days of notice of demolition.
Laura, you
guys
were
should
gonna
be
say?
noticed right away, right?
So,
Yeah, that's-
so the regulation requires notice, like a kind of a formal noticing sent to planning and zoning and the historical commission. But what happens currently is we often don't receive the formal notification, and instead the buildings department will send it over to us to let us know, because they know that we haven't been receiving them for whatever reason. So we've kind of been lucky that the buildings department stepped in, but really they should, the property owners should be reporting to the historical commission.
Okay, so I guess my point is that it's the applicant's responsibility to notice you as well as zoning, zoning and building. The question I'm
Correct.
having is where within it seems like that we have a lot, again, we get into this, we have a lot of different avenues that have to, the things have to go down. And it's similar to what we were just discussing, talking about the food outdoor dining ordinance that we're trying to, is there a way for us to look at this also from streamlining that process within this? So that it's, it is, we know absolutely you're going to get everybody gets the notice. It's a given, it's done. That the applicant is not necessarily absolutely responsible to get it to 3 different locations.
I think the applicant, which is usually I've only been getting these from the demolition people. I get an email from them and also from the building department. Lately, it's been getting a little smoother, but again, going back to a certified letter, that's probably more of a paper trail that we might have to reinstate.
Okay, well, again, my question is
Yeah.
outside of this. I mean, I understand your need for the movement towards 180 days and redefining some of this. I think we have to look at it because I think some of the language is, it's just got to look at some of the proposed language in this.
Right.
But I understand, and it aligns more with the area, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think we need to look at the process as well, so that you are getting the notices in a timely manner. And if there's a way to streamline that noticing process so that everybody gets the notice that as they're, as they come in a timely manner. That's all. That's what I'm looking
Yeah.
at. So thanks.
Mhm.
I think something else related to noticing that's important for everyone to know is that the building owner is required to put a sign somewhere on the property. And so that's where you might get people from the general public requesting the demolition delay, as opposed to someone from the historical commission or an involved party some other way. They are supposed to put a somewhat obvious sign on their property, and that gets more people involved.
Yeah, I think it's 24 by 36 size sign, and also a notice in the newspaper is required. Not that anyone reads those, but
Any further discussion on that? This whole thing, what will happen is, I guess we'll bring it back in January. Is that the idea, Brian? For further discussion?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, just does anyone know the answer to when Westport and Stamford actually made 180 days, or is it all been 180 days?
Let me take a look real quick, Josh.
I got Westport here. you sent, Brian, it says 86, but I don't. Wait, maybe, well, I can't tell.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, ordinance adopted August 5th, 2008.
Yeah,
But I guess it's
Pertain to this-
adopted 1986, yeah. Stanford doesn't say, unless I have to read the fine print, which is, I don't know when this went into effect.
well, this-
Okay, it was curious. It's something that can be looked up
2004.
later. I'm just curious if you
Yeah.
happen to know.
Yeah, it's been ongoing since the 80s for both towns.
okay. Anything, nothing else? Then I'll entertain a motion. Anyone? Dominique? Okay, motion to adjourn. All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dana.
Happy-
Thank you, Laura.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jess.
Night.
Happy holidays,
Holidays.
everyone.
Happy holidays.
Thank you, Bill.
Happy holidays.